Here's a number that should not exist. 6. Out of 22 FIFA World Cups ever played, the host nation has won the tournament exactly 6 times. Uruguay in 1930, Italy in 1934, England in 1966, West Germany in 1974, Argentina in 1978, France in 1998. 6 winners, 22 tournaments. On paper, that sounds decent, but think about what hosting actually means. You get automatic qualification, no brutal 2-year campaign where one bad night can end your World Cup before it begins. You play every game in front of your own crowd. You sleep in your own beds. You train on familiar pitches in familiar climates with no jet lag and no adaptation period. Your opponents have to fly in from around the world and adjust. You don't have to adjust at all. By every logical measure, the host nation should have an overwhelming advantage, and statistically, they do reach the semifinals at roughly double the rate of other teams. But win the whole thing? After France in 1998, nobody has. That's now over 25 years, 6 consecutive World Cups without a single host nation lifting the trophy. And the recent trend is getting worse, not better. South Africa in 2010 went out in the group stage. Brazil in 2014 suffered what their own fans called a national catastrophe. Russia in 2018 lost in the quarterfinals. Qatar in 2022 became the first host nation in history to be eliminated without winning a single game. So what is happening? Is this a curse? Is it psychology? Is it just math? And most importantly, what does this mean for the United States, Canada, and Mexico, 3 nations now co-hosting the biggest World Cup in history? Let's find out. Before we get into the data, let's make sure we're all on the same page about what the World Cup is and why hosting it is such a different kind of pressure. The FIFA World Cup is the single most watched sporting event on Earth. Not the Super Bowl, not the Olympics, the World Cup. The 2022 edition in Qatar drew an estimated 5 billion viewers across the tournament. The final alone was watched by over 1.5 billion people simultaneously. It happens once every 4 years. For most players, it represents the peak of their entire career. The one stage where individual club achievements don't matter, where it's just your country versus the world. Some of the greatest players in history, and we'll cover this in a future episode, never got to play in one at all. Now, imagine being the host nation. You don't just participate in that event, you are the event. Your stadiums, your infrastructure, your culture, your identity, all of it is on display for the entire planet. The pressure on the football team isn't just sporting pressure. It's political, it's economic. It's a matter of national pride in the most literal sense of the phrase. That distinction between participating in the World Cup and embodying it is where the data starts to get interesting. Let's be precise about what the statistics say, because the reality is more nuanced than a simple curse. Across all 22 World Cups, host nations have reached the semifinals in roughly 27% of tournaments. For non-host nations, the rate is around 12.5%, since there are always 4 semifinalists from a field of 32 or more teams. So hosts genuinely do outperform the average. The advantage is real. But here is the pattern that changes everything. The host advantage is strong in the early rounds and collapses in the knockout stages. In group stage matches, hosts win at a significantly higher rate than their FIFA ranking would predict. Home crowds, familiar conditions, and referee tendencies all contribute to this. Studies on home advantage in football consistently show that crowds influence referee decision-making, not through corruption, but through the unconscious psychological pressure of 70,000 people reacting to every call. Referees at home matches award more injury time, give more favorable decisions to the home side, and issue fewer cards against home players. This effect has been documented across dozens of studies across multiple sports. So, in the group stage, when the pressure is manageable and the crowd is electric, hosts thrive. Then the knockout rounds arrive, and something changes. In knockout football, every game is elimination. One bad half, one mistake, and you're out in front of your own people in your own stadium with your entire nation watching. The psychological weight shifts completely. And this is where the science of performance under pressure becomes essential to understanding what we're seeing. There's a well-documented phenomenon in sports psychology called choking under pressure. It is not a metaphor. It is a measurable, repeatable pattern where athletes performing in extremely high-stakes situations, particularly when they are heavily favored and expected to succeed, produce results significantly below their actual ability level. The mechanism is this. Skilled athletic performance relies on automatic, well-rehearsed motor patterns. A professional footballer doesn't consciously think about how to control a ball at pace. They've done it 10,000 times. It's automatic. But under extreme pressure, the conscious brain starts to intrude. Players start thinking about the mechanics of what they're doing instead of just doing it. That self-monitoring disrupts the automatic patterns and degrades performance. Psychologists call it paralysis by analysis. Now, here is the specific problem for host nations. The pressure doesn't come only from the match itself. It comes from the entire country watching, from the weight of expectation that has been building for years, and from the knowledge that failure will happen in front of the largest possible audience. Research published in academic journals has specifically analyzed this. A study examining the Brazilian collapse against Germany in 2014 found that the team started the match at normal performance levels, and then, once Germany scored the first goal, both cognitive and physical anxiety spiked simultaneously. Within 15 minutes, 4 more goals had gone in. The researchers described it as a total team collapse, consistent with catastrophe theory in sports psychology. A sudden, catastrophic drop in performance triggered by an initial disruption when anxiety is already at peak levels. One of the most striking pieces of evidence for this comes from a study across 17 years of elite biathlon competitions. Researchers found that even the most decorated athletes performed significantly worse, specifically missing more shots, when competing in their home country because the weight of national expectation added a layer of pressure that counteracted the familiar environment. The same research that explains home advantage also explains home disadvantage. Supportive crowds raise the stakes. When you might disappoint 60,000 of your own people instead of 60,000 strangers, failure carries a different emotional cost. And athletes, conscious or not, start playing to avoid failure rather than to win. That shift from seeking success to avoiding failure is one of the most reliable predictors of performance collapse in competitive sport. Let's run through the modern pattern and look at what the data shows in each case. France, 1998, the last host to win. France came in as genuine contenders regardless of home advantage, built around one of the best defensive structures in World Cup history. They won without conceding a single goal until the semifinals. This is the benchmark. A team strong enough that hosting amplified their strengths without adding destructive pressure. They had little to fear because they were genuinely elite. Now, look at what followed. Japan and South Korea, 2002, the first ever co-hosted World Cup. Japan reached the round of 16 before losing to Turkey. South Korea, against all statistical expectation, reached the semifinals. Their run is still the deepest by any Asian nation in World Cup history. The co-hosting dynamic is relevant here. Neither country carried the full weight of being the singular host. The pressure was distributed. Germany, 2006, the hosts reached the semifinals, losing to Italy. Strong performance, consistent with a top-ranked European team playing at home. Germany were already among the favorites. The data behaves as expected. South Africa, 2010. And here is where the modern collapse begins. South Africa became only the second host nation in history to be eliminated in the group stage. They beat France in their final group match, a math that mathematically could not save them due to goal difference. The team played in front of passionate home crowds and still couldn't produce results when it counted. Brazil, 2014, the case that defines this entire conversation. Brazil were five-time World Cup champions playing at home with arguably the most passionate football culture on the planet behind them. They had reached the semifinals having not conceded from open play in the entire tournament. Then came Germany. 5 goals in the first 29 minutes of the second half. 7 total. Brazil scored 1 in injury time when the game was already beyond any meaning. The final score, Brazil 1, Germany 7. The numbers around that match are staggering. Germany scored 5 goals in a 15-minute window, the fastest 5-goal sequence in World Cup semifinal history. Brazil's players had been visibly emotional throughout the tournament, crying at the national anthem, struggling with penalty shootouts in earlier rounds, showing signs of accumulated pressure that sports psychologists later identified as consistent with pre-competition anxiety at levels incompatible with peak performance. Russia, 2018, the hosts reached the quarterfinals before losing on penalties to Croatia. A reasonable performance given Russia's FIFA ranking. But the pattern remains. The host reached the last 8 and went no further. Qatar, 2022, the worst host performance in tournament history. Qatar spent an estimated $220 billion preparing for the World Cup. They had played preparatory tournaments across the world for years. They were the reigning Asian champions. And they became the first host nation in 92 years of World Cup history to lose their opening match, the first to be eliminated after just 2 games, and the only host nation ever to finish without a single victory. Their own coach attributed the opening game defeat partly to stage fright. The pattern is clear, but there is one more layer that the data reveals.
The 6 host nation winners all came from a specific era, 1930 to 1998. In the 25 years since France's victory, not one host has even reached the final. This is not coincidence. The modern media environment has fundamentally changed what it means to be a host nation. In 1966, England hosted and won the World Cup. The pressure was significant, but it was local. Newspaper coverage, radio, limited television. A bad result was devastating, but it was processed in a relatively contained information environment. Today, a host nation's every training session is analyzed on social media before the tournament begins. Player performances are dissected in real time by hundreds of millions of people. A star player's injury, a coach's tactical choice, a single mistake in a group stage match, all of it generates an immediate global reaction that the players cannot avoid. The feedback loop between public expectation and player psychology is now continuous, not periodic. This matters because the psychological burden on host nation players is not just larger in magnitude, it is larger in duration. Modern host players carry the weight of that expectation for months before the first game is played. They arrive at the tournament already compressed under it. The home crowd in the stadium is the final layer of pressure on top of an already saturated psychological state. Compare that to Qatar in 2022, who their own coach described as paralyzed by nerves in their opening match, a match they had known about for 12 years since the hosting decision in 2010. The infrastructure, the preparation, the investment, none of it addresses the one variable that ultimately determines football results, the mental state of the players when the whistle blows.
So, is it a curse? No. It's something more interesting than a curse. It's a structural psychological pattern that emerges when the scale of expectation exceeds any individual team's ability to absorb it. The host advantage in football is real in normal conditions, but the World Cup is not a normal condition. It is the most watched, most scrutinized, most consequential sporting event on Earth. And when the country hosting that event also has to perform in it, the two things, hosting and competing, start to pull in opposite directions. Which brings us to 2026. 3 countries are co-hosting for the first time in history: the United States, Canada, and Mexico. None of the 3 is among the realistic favorites to win the tournament. The United States, the country hosting the most games and carrying the most infrastructure weight, enters the tournament ranked well outside the top 5 in the world. In some ways, that might actually help. The psychological research suggests that the host curse is most devastating when the team is expected to win. When expectations are lower, the gap between expectation and failure is smaller, and there's less room for catastrophic collapse. The United States has nothing to prove and everything to gain, which, based on the last 25 years of data, might be exactly the right position to be in. Subscribe. Next episode, the story of how a country that once banned a group of its citizens from playing football went on to become the most successful nation in the sport's history. We're talking about Brazil and the transformation that nobody tells you about.